Dillon Gabriel is out of Cleveland, and I want to give you the honest, complete version of how this unraveled, because the way it ended tells you something important, not just about Gabriel, but about the direction this Browns organization is actually moving and what it means for Shedeur Sanders heading into 2026. This wasn't a quiet roster move dressed up in routine language. This was the conclusion of a situation that had been deteriorating across multiple dimensions simultaneously, and the full picture of why it ended the way it did is more revealing than any single headline captured. Start with the beginning, because context matters here. When Gabriel arrived in Cleveland, the reception was genuinely optimistic. Analysts were talking about his football IQ, his accuracy, his college production across multiple high-profile programs. Fans were engaged. The conversation around him had real energy. And I think it's worth acknowledging that the hype wasn't completely unfounded. His college resume was legitimate, his processing profile was interesting, and there were real reasons to think he might develop into something useful at the professional level. That's the baseline. That's what made everything that followed so avoidable and so frustrating to watch. The first visible crack came early, and it came through language, in a moment that caught immediate attention from everyone inside and outside the building. Gabriel made a comment that drew a distinction between what he called entertainers and competitors. The framing was pointed, and the direction it was pointed in wasn't subtle. In football locker rooms, that kind of language doesn't get processed neutrally. It gets processed as a statement about specific people, and the people who were in the room that day understood exactly what was being communicated. Calling someone an entertainer in a competitive professional setting is not a casual observation. It's a dismissal. It's a way of saying the competition isn't real, that one participant isn't genuinely what they appear to be. And directing that framing at Shedeur Sanders, a player who by that point had already demonstrated significant qualities that earned genuine respect inside that building, registered as something considerably more deliberate than idle trash talk. What made the comment genuinely damaging, beyond the immediate reaction, wasn't the words themselves. It was what they signaled about Gabriel's competitive psychology. Confident players who believe in their own ability don't typically frame their competition through dismissal. They compete, they outperform, they let the results handle the commentary for them. Players who reach for that kind of language are often doing something different. They're trying to manage a situation they feel less certain about through narrative rather than execution. And in a locker room full of professionals who have been around long enough to read those signals, the distinction doesn't go unnoticed. Shedeur's response to all of it was the counterpoint that made the contrast impossible to miss for anyone watching. No public rebuttal, no back and forth on social media, no carefully constructed quote designed to land on the other side of the line Gabriel had drawn. He was asked about the situation in interviews and handled it with a composure that I think genuinely impressed people who were paying attention. Calm, unbothered, focused entirely on what he could control. He described the reality plainly. Whatever was said, it didn't affect his preparation or his mindset, and he wasn't going to spend energy on it. That response wasn't performed detachment. It was the behavioral expression of someone who has been through enough externally driven pressure to have developed a genuine internal stability around it. Colorado forged that in him across 2 seasons of scrutiny that most college quarterbacks never experience at that sustained intensity, and it showed up when the NFL version of that pressure arrived. The football reality underneath all the interpersonal dynamics was moving in one direction as well, and it was moving clearly. Gabriel had moments, enough to keep the conversation going, enough for the voices in his corner to sustain their arguments about his potential, but the consistency required to separate himself in a genuine competition with Shedeur Sanders wasn't materializing. Drives that needed to be finished were stalling. Reads under pressure were coming out slow. The specific kind of calm, reliable, repeatable execution that Todd Monken needs from his quarterback, the qualities that Baltimore-influenced offensive systems reward, wasn't showing up with the regularity the competition required. And Shedeur, operating on the other side of this equation, was demonstrating exactly those qualities. Game-winning drives, tight window throws made without hesitation, decision-making that got faster and cleaner as the stakes increased rather than slower and more tentative. The coaches were watching all of it, and the gap they were seeing was not a close one. There was also a specific media dimension to this situation that I think is worth examining honestly, because it contributed to the atmosphere around the competition in ways that weren't entirely clean. Certain voices covering Cleveland were clearly invested in the Gabriel narrative, promoting his upside, highlighting his potential, and in the process of doing so, reaching for criticisms of Shedeur that didn't hold up when you actually watched the plays being discussed. Calling out decisions that worked, questioning throws that connected. It had the texture of a predetermined conclusion being worked backward toward evidence rather than evidence being followed toward a conclusion. Fans who were watching the actual football noticed the disconnect, and the credibility of those voices eroded in proportion to how far the narrative drifted from what the tape was showing. Then came the off-field dimension, which was the moment moment where the organizational patience that had been extended to Gabriel ran out. His fiancée went on social media and made direct, personal public attacks on Shedeur Sanders, not subtle commentary, not ambiguous jabs that could be read multiple ways. Direct disrespect, personal in nature, with nothing football-related to justify it, and Gabriel's response to it was silence. No attempt to shut it down, no public acknowledgement that this had crossed a line, no visible effort to separate himself from the chaos or communicate to the organization that he understood why it was unacceptable. Just nothing, as if the situation was fine, as if letting it ride was a reasonable choice in the middle of a locker room competition that already had enough tension built into it. That silence was the organizational breaking point, and I think it's the detail that explains most clearly why the end came when it did. Because the Browns had been managing the dynamics around Gabriel with a patience that reflected their original investment in his potential. They had given him room to grow. They had allowed the competitive process to play out rather than making a premature call. But an NFL locker room navigating a quarterback competition cannot absorb the additional weight of off-field personal drama being directed at a specific player by a player's family member, while the person causing the damage stays conspicuously quiet about it. That combination, the distraction, the disrespect, and the absence of any visible sense of accountability, told the organization something concrete about what life with Gabriel as a fixture in the quarterback room was going to keep looking like. And the answer was incompatible with the culture Todd Monken was hired to build. Monken's arrival was the structural turning point that made all of this resolve as quickly as it did. The new head coach came in with no prior investment in any existing hierarchy, no obligation to any player based on what the previous staff had established, and no interest in managing optics at the expense of clarity. His first press conference signals were telling in exactly the way that professional observers know how to read. He didn't mention Gabriel's name, no discussion of his potential, no language about competition remaining open, no diplomatic effort to keep multiple players feeling valued and invested, simply nothing. In NFL coaching staff communication, that specific kind of silence functions as a verdict delivered without the formality of an announcement. It tells players, staff, and observers exactly where things stand without requiring a single harsh word to do the communicating, because Monken had already done his evaluation. He had watched the film, assessed the competitive picture, and formed a clear judgment about what he was working with in that quarterback room. What he saw on one side was a player who showed up every day with full competitive commitment, who had demonstrated the composure and processing qualities that his offensive system rewards, and who had won 2 consecutive divisional games as a cold start rookie without any of the foundational preparation that quarterback performance actually requires. What he saw on the other side was a player whose on-field output wasn't matching the competition, whose behavior off the field was generating organizational friction, and who wasn't demonstrating the accountability and self-awareness that Monken's culture demanded. That evaluation didn't take long to reach a conclusion. Shedeur Sanders has been named the Cleveland Browns starting quarterback for the 2026 season. And I want to be direct about what that designation actually represents, because it's easy to let it pass as a routine roster decision, and it isn't. This is a franchise that has cycled through starting quarterbacks at a rate that became definitional to its identity for over 2 decades. Every cycle produced the same pattern: a period of cautious optimism, a gradual accumulation of doubt, a reset that started the whole thing over again. What Cleveland is doing now is something structurally different. They are committing organizational resources, draft capital, coaching staff time, scheme installation, the full infrastructure of an NFL offense, to the development of a specific quarterback with no visible hesitation about whether that quarterback is the answer. Monken has described Shedeur in terms that coaches reserve for players they've fully evaluated and fully committed to: elite playmaker. That's not language of managed expectation. That's the language of organizational belief, and it shapes everything downstream. The locker room already knows what it means when a head coach uses that language about a specific player. Receivers know whose timing they're building. Linemen know whose blind side they're protecting as their primary professional obligation. Offensive coaches know whose physical and cognitive profile they're designing the scheme around. That clarity, the organizational alignment that follows from a single, unambiguous declaration, produces the kind of collective investment that individual talent alone cannot generate. It's what Shedeur Sanders hasn't fully had since he arrived in Cleveland, and it's the most important thing the organization can give him as he steps into his first real full season as QB1. The broader picture here is one of organizational evolution that happened faster and more cleanly than most people expected. Stefanski gone, Gabriel gone, the veteran resistance to Shedeur addressed by Myles Garrett in the direct way that only Garrett could address it, Judy potentially on his way to Atlanta. The draft pointed toward building weapons around the quarterback rather than reconsidering who the quarterback should be. Monken arriving with offensive credentials built in one of the most respected systems in modern football, and immediately communicating both in language and in practice that the competitive question has been resolved. Cleveland has arrived at a quarterback situation that has the structural coherence it has been lacking for years. Whether that coherence produces wins is what 2026 will determine. But the foundation being built around Shedeur Sanders heading into this season is more legitimate than anything Cleveland has had at this position in a very long time. And the contrast with how that foundation was almost undermined makes its current existence feel genuinely earned.